He wrote letters, dozens of them, to newspapers, to detectives, to the public. Letters that began with riddles and ended with death. Each one signed with a simple, haunting symbol. A circle with a cross through it. No name, no face, no fingerprints. Just a promise. I like killing people because it's so much fun. This is the story of the Zodiac Killer, the man who taunted a nation, mocked the police, and may have written his last letter decades after everyone thought he was gone. And what if he never really stopped? It was December 20th, 1968, Northern California, the small town of Vallejo. Cold air hung over the quiet, rural roads just outside of town, the kind of stillness that only small-town America had in the 60s. Two teenagers, Betty Lou Jensen, 16, and David Faraday, 17, drove out for what should have been a simple, harmless date night. Dinner, a few laughs, and then a drive out to a local lover's lane along Lake Herman Road. But sometime around 11 p.m., their night turned into a nightmare. When police arrived, Betty Lou was lying face down in the dirt, 5 bullet wounds in her back. David was slumped beside the car, a bullet through his head. Still breathing, but barely. He died before help could arrive. There were no fingerprints, no tire tracks, no witnesses. Just the eerie silence of a crime that felt too clean, too fast, too deliberate. The town mourned, the police searched, and for 7 long months, nothing happened. Until July 4th, 1969, when he struck again. That summer night, another couple, Darlene Farron and Mike Mageau, were parked in Blue Rock Springs, not far from where Betty Lou and David were killed. Around midnight, a car pulled up behind them. Its headlights went off. Moments later, the sound of footsteps. A man approached the driver's side window holding a 9mm Luger pistol. Without a word, he opened fire. Darlene was hit multiple times. Mike was struck in the face, neck, and shoulder, but managed to survive. The shooter calmly walked back to his car. Then, for reasons no one can explain, returned and shot them both again. Then he vanished. At 12:40 a.m., just 40 minutes later, a call came into the Vallejo Police Department. The voice was calm, flat, unhurried. I want to report a double murder. If you will go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye. It was the first time the world heard the voice of the man who would become known as the Zodiac Killer. 3 weeks later, 3 identical letters arrived at 3 different newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each envelope contained a handwritten letter, roughly printed, almost childish in form, and a cryptogram composed of strange symbols. He claimed these ciphers contained his identity. "Each one of you has a part of my code," he wrote. "If you crack it, you'll have me." He demanded they be printed on the front page of each newspaper. He threatened he would cruise around all weekend killing lone people in the night. The editors complied. That week, the Bay Area woke up to a new kind of terror. Days later, a high school teacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty sat down at their kitchen table in Salinas. They studied the strange code, 408 characters long, and began noticing patterns. The cipher used repeating symbols. Some formed clusters, almost like letters forming common words. By Sunday morning, they cracked it, and what they found chilled the world. I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. The letter ended with, "When I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and the people I have killed will become my slaves. There was no name at the end, only the now infamous symbol, a circle with a cross through it. The Zodiac's mark. By August, every newsstand in San Francisco was lined with headlines about him. Every detective in Northern California was on edge. Parents kept their kids home. Couples stopped parking at lovers' lanes. He was everywhere and nowhere, a phantom haunting the streets. Police flooded the airwaves begging for tips. Dozens of men were questioned. Hundreds of letters poured in from people claiming to know him. But none of them were right. Because the truth was, he was watching the panic he created, and loving every second of it. In his next letter, he gave himself a name. This is the Zodiac speaking. It was the first time he used it, and in the start of a reign of terror that would last for years. He wasn't just a killer. He was an author of fear, a man obsessed with fame, power, and control. He didn't want to kill quietly. He wanted the world to know his name and to fear it. And the more attention he got, the more he killed. But here's where it gets even stranger. The murders stopped. The letters didn't. He would write again and again, boasting, taunting, claiming credit for murders that may not have even been his, sometimes sending pieces of blood-stained clothing to prove it. And yet, through all the letters, codes, and phone calls, he was never caught. So who was he, and why? Do some believe he's still writing? He wrote letters, dozens of them, to newspapers, to detectives, to the public. Letters that began with riddles and ended with death. Each one signed with a simple, haunting symbol, a circle with a cross through it. No name, no face, no fingerprints, just a promise. I like killing people because it's so much fun. This is the story of the Zodiac Killer, the man who taunted a nation, mocked the police, and may have written his last letter decades after everyone thought he was gone. And what if he never really stopped? It was December the 20th, 1968, Northern California, the small town of Vallejo. Cold air hung over the quiet rural roads just outside of town, the kind of stillness that only small-town America had in the 60s. Two teenagers, Betty Lou Jensen, 16, and David Faraday, 17, drove out for what should have been a simple, harmless date night. Dinner, a few laughs, and then a drive out to a local lover's lane along Lake Herman Road. But sometime around 11 p.m., their night turned into a nightmare. When police arrived, Betty Lou was lying face down in the dirt, 5 bullet wounds in her back. David was slumped beside the car, a bullet through his head, still breathing but barely. He died before help could arrive. There were no fingerprints, no tire tracks, no witnesses, just the eerie silence of a crime that felt too clean, too fast, too deliberate. The town mourned. The police searched. And for 7 long months, nothing happened. Until July 4th, 1969, when he struck again. That summer night, another couple, Darlene Farron and Mike Mageau, were parked in Blue Rock Springs, not far from where Betty Lou and David were killed. Around midnight, a car pulled up behind them. Its headlights went off. Moments later, the sound of footsteps. A man approached the driver's side window holding a 9mm Luger pistol. Without a word, he opened fire. Darlene was hit multiple times. Mike was struck in the face, neck, and shoulder, but managed to survive. The shooter calmly walked back to his car, then, for reasons no one can explain, returned and shot them both again. Then he vanished. At 12:40 a.m., just 40 minutes later, A call came into the Vallejo Police Department. The voice was calm, flat, unhurried. I want to report a double murder. If you will go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye. It was the first time the world heard the voice of the man who would become known as the Zodiac Killer. 3 weeks later, 3 identical letters arrived at 3 different newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each envelope contained a handwritten letter, roughly printed, almost childish in form, and a cryptogram composed of strange symbols. He claimed these ciphers contained his identity. "Each one of you has a part of my code," he wrote. "If you crack it, you'll have me." He demanded they be printed on the front page of each newspaper, or he threatened he would cruise around all weekend, killing lone people in the night. The editors complied. That week, the Bay Area woke up to a new kind of terror. Days later, a high school teacher named Donald Hardin and his wife, Betty, sat down at their kitchen table in Salinas. They studied the strange code, 408 characters long, and began noticing patterns. The cipher used repeating symbols. Some formed clusters, almost like letters forming common words. By Sunday morning, they cracked it. And what they found chilled the world. I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. The letter ended with, "When I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and the people I have killed will become my slaves." There was no name at the end, only the now infamous symbol, a circle with a cross through it, the Zodiac's mark. By August, every newsstand in San Francisco was lined with headlines about him. Every detective in Northern California was on edge. Parents kept their kids home. Couples stopped parking at lovers' lanes. He was everywhere and nowhere, a phantom haunting the streets. Police flooded the airwaves begging for tips. Dozens of men were questioned. Hundreds of letters poured in from people claiming to know him. But none of them were right. Because the truth was, he was watching the panic he created and loving every second of it. In his next letter, he gave himself a name. "This is the Zodiac speaking." It was the first time he used it, and the start of a reign of terror that would last for years. He wasn't just a killer. He was an author of fear, a man obsessed with fame, power, and control. He didn't want to kill quietly. He wanted the world to know his name and to fear it. And the more attention he got, the more he killed. But here's where it gets even stranger. The murders stopped. The letters didn't. He would write again and again, boasting, taunting, claiming credit for murders that may not have even been his. Sometimes sending pieces of blood-stained clothing to prove it. And yet, through all the letters, codes, and phone calls, he was never caught. So who was he, and why? Do some believe he's still writing? For most killers, the weapon is the story's end, but for the Zodiac, it was only the beginning. His true weapon was the written word. Every time he put pen to paper, he created another maze. And for half a century, the world has been trying to find its way out. It was November 8th, 1969, barely a month after the murder of cab driver Paul Stine. The San Francisco Chronicle received a new envelope. Inside, a greeting card decorated with strange symbols and scrawled handwriting. But that wasn't all. Tucked inside was a new cipher, 340 characters long, written in 17 rows of symbols. It looked even more chaotic than his first. The message would later be known as the Z340 cipher, one of the most mysterious pieces of cryptography in modern history. Experts at the FBI, NSA, and Navy tried to solve it. They failed. For decades, it mocked them, a grid of letters and symbols that refused to give up its secrets, and the Zodiac seemed to love that. The killer continued to send more letters, sometimes threatening, sometimes bizarre. He bragged about his crimes, claimed credit for others, and made impossible boasts about dozens of victims. Each message was part confession, part riddle, and part performance. He was feeding the public's obsession and their fear. Detectives started to believe that maybe the codes weren't meant to be solved at all. Maybe they were traps. Distractions meant to pull attention away from physical evidence. Still, the idea that one of his secrets might hide his identity was irresistible. The question that haunted investigators was simple. If someone solved it, would it reveal his name? Over the years, the Z340 cipher became a legend. Thousands of amateur sleuths tried to crack it. Mathematicians, linguists, even high school kids gave it a shot. Online forums exploded with theories. Some claimed it contained Bible verses. Others thought it was astrological. Many believed the cipher was unsolvable, a joke designed to waste everyone's time. But for some, it became an addiction. In basements and bedrooms, people spent sleepless nights rearranging letters, chasing patterns, hunting meaning in chaos. Decades passed. The cipher survived the rise of computers, the fall of typewriters, and the birth of the internet. And still, it mocked them all. Then, in December 2020, something happened that no one expected. A small team of private citizens, a software developer from Virginia named David Oranchak, an Australian mathematician Sam Blake, and a Belgian programmer Jarl van Eyck, decided to take another look. They used custom-built computer programs, statistical models, and endless trial runs, not to guess the key, but to feel how the Zodiac thought. Day after day they ran simulations, millions of possibilities, until finally, something clicked. The patterns began to make sense, words began to form, and slowly the message took shape. When the cipher was finally solved, more than 51 years after it was written, it didn't reveal the killer's name. But what it did reveal was a window into his mind. The decoded message was a gloating rant. He mocked police for not catching him, denied being the man who had been shown on television, and, in true Zodiac fashion, reminded everyone he had no fear of death. He wasn't afraid because, in his mind, the killing was only a transition. To him, death wasn't punishment. It was power. The FBI confirmed the code was authentic, officially ending one of the longest unsolved cryptographic mysteries in American criminal history. But even after the code was cracked, the story didn't end. It only deepened the enigma. See, the Zodiac had always claimed that one of his messages contained his true identity. Many believed that meant the 340 cipher. But now that seemed false. So where was the code that actually said his name? Detectives started combing through his earlier letters again, looking for small patterns, repetitions, or hidden acrostics. Was his name hidden in plain sight, disguised as a misspelled word, a misplaced symbol, or a joke? Dozens of theories emerged. Some claimed the Zodiac was a local man already questioned by police. Others thought he might have been in law enforcement himself, familiar enough with procedures to stay one step ahead. and a few believed something darker, that there was no single zodiac, that multiple people might have used the same symbol to keep the legend alive. Even today, 2 zodiac ciphers remain officially unsolved, the so-called Z13 and Z32. Both are shorter, far more cryptic, and believed to possibly hide names, coordinates, or taunts. One even came with a map of the San Francisco Bay Area, marked with the zodiac symbol at the center. He hinted that the key to the next crime was hidden in radians, a mathematical term for angles, as if daring investigators to treat his killings like geometry problems. The FBI, working with local police, mapped out every coordinate he referenced. No bombs were found. No clues appeared, but the fear spread all the same. The killer had found a way to make the entire Bay Area part of his puzzle. After 1974, the Zodiac's communication slowed. He sent fewer letters and the handwriting began to change, neater, more deliberate. Some questioned whether the later ones were truly from him. One, sent to the San Francisco Chronicle, praised a horror movie that had just been released. A strange, almost fan-like tone compared to his earlier rage. It was signed simply, "Yours truly, Zodiac." And then, silence. For years, nothing. Until occasionally a new letter surfaced, some confirmed hoaxes, others still debated. One appeared in the late 1970s, another in the 1980s. Each time experts argued over the handwriting, the phrasing, the symbolism. Was the Zodiac alive? Or had someone taken up his mantle, continuing the story to keep the legend breathing? No one knew for sure. In the 2000s and 2010s, technology gave investigators new hope. Forensic handwriting analysis advanced. DNA testing from old envelopes and stamps was attempted. But the problem was age. Many of the letters had been handled by too many people, stored in outdated ways, or contaminated over time. Partial DNA was found, but never enough to conclusively identify anyone. Each new lead felt like the start of a breakthrough, until it wasn't. And still, somewhere out there, those unsolved codes sit. Pages of symbols, taunting anyone who dares to look too closely. Psychologists who studied the case believe the letters were more than just ego. They were a way for the Zodiac to exist beyond his crimes. He created a character, a persona that would outlive the man behind it. The letters were his immortality. Even if he was caught, the idea of the Zodiac would never die. And he was right. More than 50 years later, his words are still being read, decoded, debated. Every new theory reignites the legend. Every new code breaker who takes a shot at his ciphers gives him one more breath of life. What if that was his real plan all along? Not to hide his name, but to make sure we never stopped saying it. When the 340 cipher was finally cracked in 2020, one line stood out. He mentioned that he didn't fear the gas chamber because, in death, he'd have new slaves. It was the same chilling philosophy that haunted his first code from 1969, an echo across time, reminding everyone that he hadn't changed at all. The cipher wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a clue. It was a statement. The Zodiac was saying, "You'll never catch me, but you'll never forget me." Why were some of the ciphers simple and others impossibly complex? Why did he suddenly stop writing? And if he really did keep sending letters, who received them? Some retired investigators claim that unverified letters arrived as late as the 2000s. If true, that would mean the Zodiac was writing into his 70s, or that someone else continued in his name. Either possibility is unsettling, because if the letters didn't stop, maybe the story didn't either. Today, the Zodiac ciphers are taught in universities, discussed in cryptography forums, and dissected in documentaries. They've inspired countless imitations, both fictional and real. But at their core, they remain what they always were: windows into a dark, calculating mind that thrived on mystery. The letters weren't meant to be solved easily, they were meant to last. Each symbol, each line was a thread woven into a narrative the killer knew would outlive him. In that sense, he succeeded. What do you think? Was the Zodiac a lone genius who encoded his identity in ways we still can't see? Or was it all a game, a riddle designed to make us look everywhere except where the truth actually was? Leave your thoughts below, because the more you try to decode him, the more his story continues. And maybe that's exactly what he wanted. In part 4, The Taunting Game, we'll explore how the Zodiac manipulated the police, played the media, and turned fear itself into his greatest masterpiece. The question isn't just how he got away with it. It's why no one could ever make him stop. It began with a letter. But what followed was a performance, a game played in headlines, on television screens, and in the minds of millions. The Zodiac didn't just kill people. He killed certainty. He turned fear itself into theater and made the entire country his audience. It's August 1st, 1969. 3 letters arrive at 3 separate California newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each envelope contains nearly identical messages, typed in uneven handwriting, signed with a strange circular cross symbol. Each claims responsibility for 2 brutal shootings that had occurred only weeks apart. But the letters come with something else: a cipher demanding publication. If the newspapers refused, the writer promised to cruise around all weekend, killing lone people in the night. This wasn't a confession, it was a command. Within hours, editors debated what to do. Was this real or a prank? Was printing it responsible journalism or a dangerous invitation? They called the police. The police called the FBI. And by the end of the night, the world had its first taste of a new kind of killer, one who used fear like ink. On August 2nd, the San Francisco Chronicle gave in. The cipher and letter were printed on the front page. Within minutes, readers were transfixed. People began cutting out the cryptograms, circling symbols, trying to play detective at home. The killer had forced the media to become his megaphone. The next morning, the Vallejo Times-Herald received another note. This time, the writer demanded something new: recognition. He wanted the police to call him by a name. This is the Zodiac speaking. It wasn't just a signature, it was branding, a mythology in the making. As soon as the letters went public, detectives found themselves fighting on 2 fronts, one against the killer and one against the news cycle. Every detail, every rumor became breaking news. Witness sketches were splashed across television screens. Reporters camped outside police stations, desperate for the next headline. And behind the scenes, investigators were struggling with something they didn't want to admit. The Zodiac seemed to be watching them. Every time the police released information, the next letter referenced it, mocking, correcting, or twisting it. When officers called him a liar, he wrote back, calling them fools. When a detective suggested he'd gone quiet, a new envelope arrived days later, as if to prove he was still in control. It wasn't just murder anymore, it was psychological warfare. Within weeks, the Bay Area became gripped by paranoia. People saw danger in every shadow, every passing car. Schools shortened hours. Couples stopped visiting the lovers' lanes where two of the Zodiac's victims had been found. Police lines were flooded with calls, most from terrified citizens reporting suspicious men. It was chaos, and the Zodiac was feeding on it. Every letter he sent turned into a spectacle, every cryptic phrase a headline. He didn't need to kill often, all he needed to do was write. Then came the TV moment. October 22, 1969. The Jim Dunbar Show, a live morning talk program out of San Francisco. The phone lines lit up. A man claiming to be the Zodiac was on the line. He said he wanted to speak to a specific lawyer, Melvin Belli, a famous defense attorney. "Please help me," the voice said. "I can't stop killing." The world froze. Millions were watching live. Was this the real Zodiac? Or another hoax feeding off the frenzy he'd created? Police scrambled to trace the call, but the man hung up. Later, detectives discovered he wasn't the Zodiac at all, just a disturbed patient from a psychiatric hospital. But the damage was done. The killer's myth had evolved. He wasn't just a man anymore, he was a phantom the public helped build. By the end of 1969, the Zodiac had become a household name. The newspapers published every letter. Radio hosts debated his intelligence, his motives, even his handwriting style. Movies and pulp novels started referencing him indirectly. The killer had become content, a story too strange to look away from. And he knew it. His later letters sounded smug, almost playful. He began to rate his own crimes, taunt detectives by name, and even joke about the movie The Most Dangerous Game. He wasn't just mocking the law, he was mocking the people who gave him their attention. Every time the public panicked, the Zodiac won. Every time they turned their eyes to him, his legend grew. In one of his letters, the Zodiac drew a diagram of a bomb, claiming he'd planted it near a school bus. He threatened to shoot the children as they come bouncing out. The city froze. Parents refused to send their kids to school. Police cars followed every yellow bus that rolled down the highway. No bomb was ever found. But the psychological damage was irreversible. The killer had discovered something more powerful than bullets: control. He didn't need to strike again. He just needed to promise that he might. Behind closed doors, detectives from multiple jurisdictions met in secret. They compared notes, handwriting, and theories. Some believed he was local. Others thought he was military, maybe even law enforcement. But what frustrated them most was how the media kept interfering. One slip of information could send thousands of false leads flooding in. At one point, a police department received over 1,000 tips in a single day, all from people convinced their neighbor, co-worker, or ex-boyfriend was the Zodiac. Everyone wanted to solve it. No one actually could. And the killer was counting on that. In March 1971, the Los Angeles Times received another Zodiac letter, this time referencing an unsolved case hundreds of miles away. It was strange, almost as if he was expanding his territory, trying to prove his reach. He bragged about misleading police, teased that he was cracking jokes while they chased ghosts. He even began using playful nicknames, Blue Meanies, mocking the police directly. That one letter revealed something chilling. The Zodiac didn't see law enforcement as an enemy. He saw them as his co-stars. Psychologists later said that what made the Zodiac different wasn't just the violence, it was the interaction. He turned the press and police into unwilling participants in his story. He wrote, they reacted. He threatened. They warned. He created, and they published. Every step of the way, the line between killer and audience blurred. The Zodiac didn't want anonymity, he wanted infamy, and the media gave it to him. By 1974, letters slowed. Police pressure grew, and the city slowly began to move on. But the killer's name still haunted headlines. That year, a new letter arrived, praising The Exorcist, calling it the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen. It was bizarre, sardonic, and signed with his familiar symbol. It ended with 2 words that echoed across decades. Yours truly, Zodiac. That was the last confirmed letter, but it wasn't closure. It was a curtain drop. The performance had ended, but the legend remained. The Zodiac Killer's reign of terror was short, roughly 5 years. But his manipulation of the media changed true crime forever. He proved that you didn't need to be everywhere to be feared everywhere. All you needed was attention. Police stations across America rewrote their press policies because of him. Reporters learned not to publish threats without verification. The FBI developed new communication protocols for taunting criminals. His letters reshaped the system. Even today, his methods echo in modern crimes. Killers who crave headlines, internet trolls who thrive on chaos, people who manipulate attention like a weapon. The Zodiac's game was a blueprint for control through fear and fascination. He didn't just write letters. He wrote a manual, one that the world is still trying not to read again. He wanted to be famous. He wanted to be eternal. And somehow, he won. Was the Zodiac a criminal genius who planned every move? Or a man who stumbled into infamy because we gave him exactly what he wanted? An audience? When the cameras turned on, he spoke. When the newspapers printed his words, he laughed. And when we looked away, he vanished. Maybe the game never really ended. Maybe it just moved online. So ask yourself, if the Zodiac were alive today, would you be one of the first to click his story? In Part 5, The Suspects, we'll explore the men police believed might have been the Zodiac, the evidence that nearly exposed him, and the truth that slipped through their fingers. The question remains, did we ever really get that close? For half a century, investigators have chased a ghost, a man who wrote his own legend, then disappeared behind a symbol. But if the Zodiac was real and not just myth, then he had to be someone. And tonight, we follow the names that came closest to breaking the mystery. The first detectives on the case built lists, hundreds of names. Ex-soldiers, reclusive mechanics, high school teachers, even a few law enforcement officers. Each tip felt promising. Each suspect, for a moment, seemed to fit. But one name would soon rise above all others: Arthur Lee Allen. Born in 1933, Allen was an ex-school teacher living in Vallejo, California, near the site of the Zodiac's first confirmed murders. He was intelligent, eccentric, and known for a dark sense of humor that unsettled those around him. When police first interviewed him in 1969, Allen admitted he had a fascination with killing. He told one friend he'd like to hunt people for sport. That friend later told detectives, and that statement alone placed Allen under a permanent shadow. Investigators discovered Allen wore a wristwatch made by Zodiac brand, the same circle-cross logo engraved on the dial. He owned weapons similar to those used in the crimes. He was ambidextrous, capable of changing handwriting styles. Everything about him seemed to whisper, guilty. Then came a moment investigators never forgot. During questioning, an officer casually mentioned the Zodiac name. Allen leaned back, smiled slightly, and said, "I'm not the Zodiac, but if I were, I certainly wouldn't tell you." Forensic experts compared Allen's handwriting to the Zodiac letters. At first glance, there were similarities. The spacing, the heavy pressure, certain looping characters. But side-by-side analysis proved inconclusive. The experts ruled that Allen's writing did not match. Police felt the case slipping through their fingers. Still, suspicion lingered. In the 1970s, officers searched Allen's home and trailer. They found weapons, animal blood on knives, and disturbing sexual materials, but no proof connecting him to the Zodiac murders. And yet, whenever a new clue surfaced, Allen's name returned. Even after he died in 1992, many detectives still believed he'd been the one. In the early 2000s, new technology offered hope. DNA profiling. Forensic teams collected saliva traces from Zodiac envelopes and compared them to samples from surviving suspects. Allen's DNA did not match, nor did his fingerprints. For many, that cleared him. For others, it only deepened the mystery. Had the Zodiac used someone else's saliva to seal the letters? Had time contaminated the samples? The evidence that might have closed the case instead kept it alive. The next major name came from an unlikely place, a newspaper newsroom. Richard Gaikowski was a journalist in San Francisco during the Zodiac's active years. He edited underground papers, criticized police, and loved codes and wordplay. Several co-workers described him as intense, brilliant, but strange. One even said his speech patterns resembled the Zodiac's letters: sarcastic, cryptic, taunting. In 2009, a group of online sleuths noticed that Gaikowski's initials, RG, appeared in one of the Zodiac's ciphers when arranged a certain way. Coincidence or clue? They also discovered that his office stood less than a mile from where the Zodiac mailed some of his letters. Gaikowski's passport suggested he'd been abroad during one of the killings, but the timeline wasn't airtight. When a private investigator later played a recording of Gaikowski's voice to a surviving Zodiac victim, the man reportedly said, "It sounds like him." Yet without DNA or physical proof, it remained just that, a sound. When Gaikowski died in 2004, the debate followed him to the grave. Another favorite among armchair detectives, Lawrence Kane, a Navy veteran with documented head injuries and a criminal record for voyeurism. He lived near many of the Zodiac's crime scenes, and his photo, according to some, resembled the police sketch. One surviving victim, Kathleen Johns, who'd escaped a man claiming to be the Zodiac, once looked at Kane's picture and said she believed he was the one, but there was no forensic evidence, no confession, and no letter linking him directly. Just eerie coincidences, a habit of using false identities, and a background in cryptography from his Navy training. Kane died in 2010. Another possible answer lost to time. Then came the story of Ross Sullivan, a quiet, intelligent library worker in Riverside, California. He wore military-style boots, just like the prints left at one of the crime scenes. After a local college student named Sherry Jo Bates was murdered in 1966, a case some believe was Zodiac's first. Co-workers said Sullivan vanished for several days. When he returned, he was different, withdrawn, distracted. Police questioned him back then, but nothing concrete tied him to the crime. Years later, after the Zodiac's letters emerged, Riverside detectives saw disturbing parallels between the anonymous notes sent after Bates's death and the Zodiac's later writing style. Sullivan checked several boxes: mental health struggles, cryptic writing, proximity to early crime scenes. But again, no hard proof. Sullivan died in 1977, never charged, never cleared. In 2014, a man named Gary Stewart published a book claiming his biological father, Earl Van Best Jr., was the Zodiac killer. The story exploded across talk shows and YouTube theories. Stewart's argument: his father resembled the Zodiac sketch, shared a handwriting style, and had a criminal past. He even found eerie coincidences in the cipher patterns. But official investigators reviewed the claims and dismissed them. No verified DNA, no credible physical evidence, and several timeline conflicts. Still, the theory added another layer to the endless mythology. A reminder that for every suspect eliminated, two more appear. When the 340 cipher was finally cracked in 2020, crypt analyst David Orenchak and his team found no names inside, no hint of identity, just a gloating voice. For many, that confirmed what detectives had feared all along. The Zodiac never intended to reveal who he was. He built his codes as traps, puzzles that promised answers but led only to more questions. But some investigators still believe that within his smaller ciphers, the Z13 or Z32, the killer hid personal markers. Tiny pieces of a signature that no one has yet recognized. Maybe the name has been in front of us all along. Or maybe it never existed at all. As technology advanced, hope returned once more. In the late 2010s, forensic genealogy, the same method that caught the Golden State Killer, was used to re-examine the Zodiac evidence. Partial DNA sequences from his envelopes were compared against public genealogy databases. But the results were inconclusive, too degraded, too partial. Then, in 2021, a group calling themselves the Case Breakers claimed to have identified the Zodiac as a man named Gary Francis Post, a deceased Air Force veteran. They pointed to scars on his forehead, resembling the Zodiac sketch, and letters that allegedly contained his full name encrypted within them. The media storm returned. Headlines once again declared, "Zodiac identified." But within weeks, the FBI and San Francisco police quietly responded. The case remains open and unsolved. Another circle closed. Another promise unfulfilled. Every few years, a new suspect rises. Each one fits the story just enough to be believable, and just imperfectly enough to keep it alive. It's almost as if the Zodiac designed it that way, a puzzle that renews itself with every generation. Detectives now say the killer might never be officially named. The DNA may never be whole enough, the handwriting never certain enough. But the investigation continues, quietly, persistently, waiting for a break that may come from a single cell of saliva on an old yellowing envelope. Is it evidence or belief? In the Zodiac case, the two often blurred. Detectives followed instinct as much as science, because the killer's unpredictability made logic unreliable. Every false lead, every rumor, every near match kept the myth growing. It wasn't just about finding a name. It was about proving that a story this strange could have an ending. But the longer it went unsolved, the clearer it became. The Zodiac's true legacy wasn't the murders. It was the chase. Some retired officers believe the Zodiac may have been an ordinary man, A quiet neighbor, maybe even someone interviewed early on and dismissed. Others think he was a drifter, slipping through towns with no trace, leaving nothing but letters. Psychologists describe him as narcissistic, organized, craving control. Not a genius and not, but a man who understood one thing perfectly: attention. He built his own mythology and then vanished inside it. And maybe that's why the case still haunts us. Because even now, we're still looking for a man who might have never truly existed outside the story he created. For half a century, detectives have been picking up that call, reopening the file, tracing old letters, scanning the same fingerprints again and again. Every time the silence on the other end feels louder. What if the Zodiac died decades ago? What if he's still alive? Watching the documentaries, the YouTube videos, the podcasts, hearing us speak his name. We may never know. But the power he created in that combination of mystery, fear, and fascination still echoes in every unsolved case that follows. Who do you think the Zodiac was? Arthur Lee Allen, the teacher with a secret life? Richard Gaikowski, the journalist hiding in plain sight? Ross Sullivan, the withdrawn librarian who vanished after a murder? Or someone we've never even heard of? Drop your theory below. Because every time someone takes another look at this case, the story continues. In Part 6, The Silence and the Shadow, we'll follow the final years of the hunt, the detectives who refuse to give up, and the haunting question that may never be answered. Did the Zodiac really stop? Or did the world just stop looking? For years, he haunted California like a phantom of ink and fear, taunting police, mocking the press, leaving behind coded letters that promised more blood, more puzzles, more sleepless nights. The world had watched in horror as his words cut as deeply as his crimes. But then, he went quiet, and in that silence the mystery only deepened. The city had changed since the Zodiac's last confirmed letter. The headlines had shifted to politics, protests, and new crimes. But for those who had lived through his reign of fear, detectives, reporters, and victims' families, the quiet wasn't peace. It was pressure. A pressure that built in the silence, because no one believed he was truly gone. Files still sat open on desks at the San Francisco Police Department, edges yellowed, notes scribbled in fading ink. Detectives who once chased his shadows had retired or transferred, but the case, the name, and those symbols carved into public memory refused to fade. Every few months the phone would ring, a caller swearing they'd cracked a code, a letter claiming a new sighting, someone insisting their neighbor was the Zodiac. Most were false alarms, but the silence made every whisper feel like it mattered. Then, 4 years after the world thought the Zodiac had vanished, another letter arrived, mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle, the same paper he'd once used as his stage. Beat. The envelope was eerily familiar, the scrawled handwriting, the postmark, the confidence. Inside the same old patterns, a short, chilling note, a claim of identity, a reminder he was still out there. But this time, not everyone believed it. Forensic analysts compared the letter to the originals. Some said the handwriting matched. Others called it a forgery, maybe a hoax, maybe an ex-cop trying to stir up old ghosts. The uncertainty was worse than any answer. Because if it was him, it meant he'd been watching quietly, waiting for the world to forget. And if it wasn't, Someone else had decided to wear his mask. By the late 1970s, the original task force had fractured. Many detectives had moved on to other cases, but a handful never stopped. They carried pieces of the Zodiac's puzzle in their minds. His symbols, his language, his taunts. One retired investigator once said, "It's like the case doesn't want to be solved. Every time you think you found the pattern, it moves." And that's what the silence did. It made the Zodiac less a man and more a myth. A ghost, hiding in every unsolved homicide, every mysterious cipher, every letter that crossed a newsroom desk. They say obsession has a smell: stale coffee, old paper, sleepless nights. That's what filled the rooms where detectives pored over files long past midnight, chasing a phantom who had long since disappeared. Years passed. Technology advanced. And then another letter. This one sent to the Vallejo Times-Herald, a newspaper that had covered the earliest murders back in 1969. The writer claimed to be the Zodiac. The handwriting, strange, the tone, different. But the promise, the same. He said he'd returned. Police debated for weeks. Was this the killer, aging and desperate for attention? Or just another pretender feeding on the legend? Experts examined the ink, the postmark, the paper fibers. Every detail told a different story, and yet, deep down, investigators feared one simple truth. If this was him, he'd never truly stopped watching. 2 more letters arrived in the early 1990s. Each carried familiar threats, cryptic phrasing, and those chilling crosshair symbols. By now, a new generation of detectives was handling the case. Most had grown up during the Zodiac's terror, watching their parents lock doors and whisper about the man who wrote to newspapers. To them, this wasn't just a file. It was a ghost story that had come back to life. Still, handwriting experts were divided again. Some saw the same slanted penmanship, others saw mimicry, no definitive proof, no closure, and yet every letter reignited public fear. Old survivors were called again. News anchors dusted off black and white footage. The Zodiac had returned to the spotlight without ever needing to show his face. He was no longer just a man. He was a myth made of paper, ink, and terror. When the new millennium arrived, something changed. Amateur sleuths began forming online. Forums, message boards, communities obsessed with decoding every cipher and every theory. The Zodiac case found new life in the digital age. His old letters were scanned, dissected, color-enhanced. Cryptographers, programmers, and armchair detectives all dove in, hunting for meaning in every symbol, every slip of the pen. They debated endlessly. Was he a lone genius, a team, a copycat network? Even decades later, people still received anonymous messages claiming to know the truth. Some said they were written by the Zodiac himself, still alive, still watching. But truth and illusion blurred online. The silence had evolved, from the stillness of old newspapers to the endless echo chamber of the internet. And in that noise, his shadow grew louder than ever. For those who had lived the nightmare firsthand, each resurfaced letter was a wound reopened. Survivors who had tried to move on were dragged back into fear and speculation. Families of victims received calls from journalists every time the story reignited. And investigators, many now old men, admitted privately that the case haunted them. They spoke of dreams where the killer's voice whispered from the dark, taunting them with half-solved clues. The silence between letters wasn't peace. It was a countdown. because everyone who had touched the case knew one thing. When he went quiet, it never meant he was gone. Then, after decades of half-truths and forgeries, something remarkable happened. One of the Zodiac's most infamous unsolved ciphers, the 340 cipher, was finally cracked by a team of private citizens in 2020. It revealed no confession, no name, just more riddles, and a chilling reminder of his ego. He had promised long ago that his identity was hidden in the codes. But what if that was the final game? What if the mystery was the point? That his legacy would never die because the world would never stop searching. Somewhere in that silence, maybe that's exactly what he wanted. So the question lingers. Did the Zodiac stop writing? Or did we stop noticing? Some believe he died quietly, his secret buried with him. Others believe he simply adapted, his letters replaced by digital whispers, his clues scattered in plain sight. But as technology advances, DNA, AI, data forensics, the past grows less secure. Every trace of his crimes, every lick of an envelope, every smudge of ink may yet tell the truth. And somewhere, perhaps, in a forgotten drawer or sealed evidence locker, the final letter still waits to be read. Because in the world of unsolved mysteries, silence doesn't mean it's over. It only means the next clue hasn't been found yet. Coming next, Part 7, Modern Breakthroughs, where science, obsession, and time collide, and the ghost of the Zodiac faces a new kind of detective. Decades had passed since the last known Zodiac letter found its way into a newsroom. The world had changed, but his mystery refused to die. In a new century ruled by data and DNA, the hunt for a ghost began again. When cold case units returned to the Zodiac files, they brought new weapons, genetic sequencing, digital forensics, and global communication. What the original detectives had filed away in cardboard boxes, the new investigators scanned, indexed, and uploaded into national databases. Old envelopes were opened once more, carefully, like relics from an ancient war. Technicians scraped for microscopic traces of saliva, sweat, skin. They hoped that the killer, like whoever he was, had left behind the one thing he couldn't control, his DNA. But every test returned the same frustration: partial profiles, degraded samples, contamination from the very hands that had once handled the evidence. Still, hope lingered, because each year the science grew sharper. In 2018, another California cold case shattered history. The Golden State Killer was identified through genetic genealogy, a method that used public DNA databases to find relatives of a suspect. For Zodiac investigators, it was a revelation. If Joseph D'Angelo could be unmasked after 40 years, why not him? Suddenly, agencies across Northern California requested new testing on every piece of evidence: stamps, envelopes, tape, even the backs of letters. For the first time in decades, the name Zodiac appeared again on active lab requests. While police re-examined evidence, the internet roared to life. Thousands of amateur sleuths, coders, linguists, cryptographers joined online communities devoted entirely to cracking the case. Forums buzzed with theories. YouTube videos dissected every letter. Digital maps traced the killer's possible routes block by block. In that digital noise, something unexpected happened: cooperation. Where once detectives guarded information, now code breakers from around the world pooled their minds together. And in 2020, they succeeded. An international trio, an American programmer, an Australian mathematician, and a Belgian software developer, finally cracked the notorious 340 cipher. It had baffled experts for 50 years. The message revealed no name, no confession, only taunting fragments, reaffirming the killer's pride and his belief that he would never be caught. The discovery went viral, reigniting global obsession. The Zodiac had spoken again, not through new letters, but through his old code, finally giving up a secret. Yet it wasn't closure. It was a reminder. Even when you think you've silenced him, he finds a way to speak. With renewed attention came new names. Armchair detectives and journalists began connecting modern clues to long-debated suspects. There was Arthur Lee Allen, the early favorite, a man whose life eerily mirrored the killer's timeline, but whose DNA and fingerprints failed to match. Then came others. Handwriting experts pointed to new figures. Some former investigators hinted at private suspects never made public. In 2021, a private investigative group calling itself the Case Breakers announced they had identified the Zodiac as Gary Francis Post, a deceased house painter and Air Force veteran. They cited alleged code connections, scars, and old photographs. For a moment, headlines exploded, Zodiac identified at last. But officials were cautious. The FBI and San Francisco police quietly stated, the case remains open. No confirmed DNA match. No definitive proof. And so the legend lived on, one suspect more in a long line of maybes. Science had caught up to almost every killer of the 20th century, except this one. Each advance in technology raised the same haunting question. Was the Zodiac's survival a failure of evidence or proof of his genius? Some experts believe the truth lies in contamination. Too many hands, too many years. Others argue the killer anticipated this future, deliberately using methods that would erase him. He sealed his envelopes differently. He left fingerprints too partial to confirm. He controlled the narrative, even beyond the grave. What kind of mind plans for immortality like that? Modern detectives now work with machine learning algorithms that scan letters, symbols, and writing patterns, searching for linguistic fingerprints. AI models compare his phrasing to millions of other writings from the era. Handwriting software measures pressure points, curves, rhythm, every flick of the wrist. Each new test edges closer to something that feels like recognition, but never quite certainty. As one analyst said, the Zodiac hides between probabilities. And that may be the key. His identity isn't in what he wrote, but in how he made people look for him. Even as science races forward, the emotional shadow remains. Families still wait for answers. Retired detectives still keep boxes in their attics. Reporters who once covered the case admit they still check their mail with a twinge of unease. The Zodiac is more than a mystery. He's a mirror, showing how obsession, fear, and the search for closure can consume generations. Now, in labs lit by cold blue monitors, younger analysts study old paper under digital microscopes. They see fibers glowing like constellations, ink bleeding like galaxies. Each trace, each molecule, a potential key. They talk less about the killer's evil and more about the data. They run simulations, upload DNA fragments to genealogical trees, and wait. Maybe the match will come tomorrow, maybe never. But one click could unmask a ghost, and when it does, the silence of half a century will finally break. Every cold case teaches two things: the limits of evidence and the endurance of curiosity. The Zodiac's story has outlived almost everyone involved, but his legacy is now woven into the DNA of investigation itself. The the drive to keep asking questions long after logic says to stop. That, perhaps, is his final cipher. So where does that leave us? We have technology capable of mapping the human genome, yet the shadow of a killer from the 1960s still evades us. Maybe the final answer isn't buried in an old envelope or a code. Maybe it's in us. The way we can't let him go, the way mystery feeds meaning. Because as long as we keep searching, he remains alive in the margins of history. And somewhere behind the hum of servers and lab machines, a single sample waits, microscopic, silent, powerful enough to end the story forever. For more than half a century, the Zodiac's shadow has stretched across generations, a story that refuses to end, a riddle that refuses to be solved. But now, in the age of algorithms and artificial intelligence, the final chapter begins, not in the dark streets of San Francisco, but in glowing rooms filled with code, data, and determination. By the 2020s, the Zodiac wasn't just a name in an archive. He was a living symbol of obsession, mystery, and the limits of human understanding. Every few years, someone would claim to have solved it all. A new suspect, a new cipher, a new revelation. And each time the world would hold its breath, only for the fog to settle again. But something had changed. Forensic science was no longer chasing criminals from the outside in. It was reading the very code of life itself. And somewhere, among hundreds of evidence fragments, scientists believed the Zodiac's genetic fingerprint might still be waiting. In early 2023, a new generation of code breakers began re-examining the remaining unsolved Zodiac ciphers using AI pattern analysis. Instead of brute force decryption, they trained language models to learn his habits, his rhythm, his sentence structure, even the way he liked to twist irony into horror. The results were unsettling. The program began generating sentences eerily similar to the Zodiac's known letters. It recognized patterns hidden not just in the characters, but in the spaces between them, as though the killer had designed his codes not merely to hide words, but to mimic thought itself. That discovery raised a haunting question. Was the Zodiac truly a cryptographer? Or simply a man who understood chaos better than anyone else? In late 2024, a small lab in Sacramento quietly began retesting one of the original envelopes, the one that had survived decades of handling and contamination. Using ultra-sensitive DNA extraction, they recovered a partial genetic sequence. It wasn't enough for a match, but it was something new. Something untouched since the letter was sealed. They compared it against databases. No direct hit, no family match, just an anonymous signature floating in digital limbo, waiting for one more piece of data to connect it. Some say that sample may already belong to the killer. Others argue it's just another dead end. But for the first time in 50 years, the possibility of biological proof exists. Even as science closes in, a different question has begun to haunt investigators. Why does the Zodiac endure when so many other killers have faded into history? Maybe it's because he was never fully seen. His identity became a canvas for fear, intellect, and imagination. Every theory, every name says more about us than it does about him. He became an idea rather than a man, and ideas can't be arrested. The internet age has given rise to hundreds of so-called Zodiac imitators. From cryptic emails to social media accounts mimicking his voice, each one stirs a new ripple of anxiety, and fascination. But investigators have learned to separate myth from data. They study tone, metadata, timestamps, even the digital handwriting left behind by keystrokes. And time after time, the results are the same. Fakes, hoaxes, people chasing the thrill of mystery. The real Zodiac, if he ever still lived, would be in his 80s or 90s, most likely gone. And yet, every so often a new letter surfaces in an old drawer, or a photograph of handwriting sparks a familiar chill. Each time, the silence breaks for just a moment, long enough to remind the world he's not forgotten. In 2025, a group of independent researchers released a theory that the Zodiac's final unsolved cipher, the so-called 32-character code, wasn't a traditional encryption at all. It was a map. Using satellite overlays of the Bay Area and old police reports, they found alignments between the cipher's symbols and the positions of the Zodiac's known crimes. When connected, the points formed a pattern, a circle intersected by a cross. The very symbol he signed his letters with. To some, it was coincidence. To others, proof that the killer had designed his crimes as part of a larger, horrifying game, one that ended exactly where it began, with his own emblem. If that's true, then the Zodiac's greatest cipher was never meant to be solved. It was meant to keep the world looking forever. One retired detective who had spent 40 years on the case once said, "Every time I think we're done, someone calls with a new theory. He's like a ghost that knows when we stop talking about him, and that's when he knocks again." That same detective still keeps a framed copy of one of the Zodiac's letters in his study, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. He said it represents both his greatest failure and his greatest lesson. That evil doesn't always need to win to endure. It just needs to be remembered. Maybe the Zodiac's real cipher wasn't in his symbols at all. Maybe it was psychological, designed to turn everyone who studied him into part of the story. Each detective, each journalist, each internet theorist became a character in his puzzle, chasing an answer that may never exist. Because if the point of a cipher is to be solved, the point of the Zodiac was the opposite, to never end. Today, the case stands at a strange crossroads. Some experts believe the truth is already in the evidence, hidden in an overlooked fingerprint, a misfiled photograph, a scrap of tape under a microscope. Others believe the name Zodiac might represent more than one person, perhaps a small network or a copycat who carried the torch when the original disappeared. Still others claim the case should finally be left in peace. That closure isn't always possible, and sometimes the absence of answers is what gives a mystery its power. The circle and cross symbol, once a mark of fear, has become part of pop culture. Movies, books, games, even music videos borrow it, sometimes without knowing its origin. It's been transformed from a killer's taunt into a cultural artifact. Something strange, unsettling, and eternal. That transformation might be the only true defeat of the Zodiac. His symbol no longer belongs to him. It belongs to everyone who refused to stop searching. 50 years after the first murder, the Zodiac story stands as one of the last great American mysteries. It has outlived its witnesses, its investigators, and almost certainly its culprit. And yet, its presence remains alive in every corner of the internet, every cold case forum, every mind that still whispers, "What if we missed something?" Maybe one day technology will find that final thread, a speck of DNA, a match in a genealogy tree, a forgotten fingerprint finally linked. Or maybe the answer will dissolve quietly into history, unsolved but unforgettable. Because sometimes the purpose of a mystery isn't to reveal the truth, it's to remind us that the unknown still exists. And in a world that has mapped every inch of the earth, that might be the last real mystery of all.